let me make one thing perfectly clear when it comes to newer episodes after the third season, because by this point, with this episode being nearly 16 years old once we head into November, I don't consider the post-movie episodes as new episodes anymore, and at this point, this entire thing of talking about terrible Spongebob episodes is starting to become a lot more repetitive than anything, and it doesn't help that through my last reviews involving Spongebob, it's mostly negative. And let me just point this out, this episode is really good. I can give it credit. I can watch this episode than the Flannel Foes episode. However, the issue with this episode is not because of the movie rehashing the same idea, because at this point, that argument is mostly worthless. I mean, if you like the third movie, that's good for you. The issue is how the post-movie episodes just derailed the characters and infernalize them in one of the worst ways. But I'm gonna get to that later. SpongeBob heads home with a huge bag of snail food that he's about to feed Gary with, but unfortunately, he gets a package involving the Dirty Bubble Challenge where he has to hit a paddle ball for so many times in order to reach the new record. And consider how many times he has to hit it. His obsession involving Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy has gone a little too far, let's just say. I gotta say, the first time I saw this, it didn't feel like a big deal, but rewatching this now, oh my god. 29 trillion times in a row? I gotta say that the world building in this show honestly becomes a lot more difficult to get used to, but on the other hand, the logic in this show just instantly becomes a lot more interesting in the fact that it has so much of a style to the point that it just never gets old for some fans. Because of this, his obsession goes way too far that he instantly ignores Gary because of the food that is still outside of his house. And considering that SpongeBob completely throws Gary into the kitchen, this leads to him leaving SpongeBob's house. This premise of Gary leaving actually really sums up of how this relationship between SpongeBob and Gary is if you watch the first 3 seasons of the show, but by this point you probably already have. If there's one thing I can give this episode much more credit is that they were planning on making this a season 3 episode, since that the third season was going to be the final one. Well, from Hillenburg's decisions, but since that Nickelodeon wants more episodes, I can say that the earlier episodes after the movie, even though that they end up turning into disasters, I can guarantee you that they actually put the heart and soul into this episode in order to show how much you actually respect SpongeBob as a character, of how much he respects and cares towards his pet Gary. And for how SpongeBob is really desperate in order to beat the Dirty Bubble Challenge, no matter how many times he has to hit the bar, this is actually something that people can get over the head during their childhood for the most. Because SpongeBob is still a child, not really much of a grown adult, said by Mr. Krabs, but at the same time, even if he's living in a pineapple by himself, and the fact that he doesn't usually do much other than just moving forward with his life, other than just working at the Krusty Krab, I can easily relate to SpongeBob in this episode for how much he is desperate in order to beat the challenge. And yet it makes sense onto why Gary left in the first place, so that you can actually see that Gary just wants to be appreciative just so that people can feed him. Granted, him getting feeds is literally all that matters onto why he left in the first place, but on the other hand, it actually shows that you can actually see of how much SpongeBob cares towards Gary, because but by those 4 words, a path for Gary, that episode instantly damages anything involving this episode, which is probably one of the issues of why I don't consider this episode one of my favorites. It's because of the aftermath. Granted, when it comes to ranking top SpongeBob episodes, I'm mostly debatable on which episode is superior, but after this episode, a lot just isn't the same. and that is really what really damages this episode the most. Say all you want, but at the same time, I never forget for what SpongeBob did afterwards. As for the majority of this episode, it settles around SpongeBob and Patrick just trying to search for Gary after he ran away. And this leads to probably one of my favorite moments throughout the entire show. And yes, I'm talking about SpongeBob and Patrick breaking into Squidward's bathroom while he screams for about 10 or 15 seconds or longer. For how many memes that people did out of this one joke alone, I can actually admire of how much Squidward is paranoid to the point that he didn't really expect anything like this to happen when SpongeBob and Patrick are searching for Gary. Anyway, the second half of the episode, Gary runs into an old lady who she calls Gary Miss Tupsy. Let me just say of how much that this character actually becomes a good place for Gary to sleep in. The more I learn about her after rewatching this episode, the more dark this episode actually got. And I'm being serious. For an episode that involves Gary missing and SpongeBob needs to find him, there was a lot of dark moments in this episode, and it's actually done a lot more better than any of the dark moments after this episode from this show. Getting back to SpongeBob, he has searched Gary all night last night, and during the day where he has to work at the Krusty Krab, he just couldn't walk. He just couldn't because he can't get over Gary being gone and all. I'm really relating to SpongeBob a lot more than anything that he does in the later seasons, since that he's actually in character like he was in the earlier seasons. And I can give this episode a lot more credit since that it was one of the first episodes after the post-movie era. So I can understand that episodes like this can consider be really good when it comes to the post-movie era. And yes, I did see people talk about the good episodes from the post-movie era. It's just that the bad episodes, if they weren't that offensive or really that brutally terrible, then maybe the good episodes wouldn't be overshadowed. And when Mr. Krabs tells him about hard work in order to get Gary back home, it actually hits SpongeBob a lot, even though what Mr. Krabs really meant is working at the Krusty Krab. So SpongeBob decides to take matters into his own hands by placing posters on walls while also making an article involving his pets missing, and he does everything with Patrick by his side. And this leads to the song Gary Come Home sung later in the episode. Even though I'm not a fan of SpongeBob songs, this song, however, it's a really good song, to be quite honest, and it makes this episode a lot more entertaining, not to mention heartwarming between the bond of SpongeBob and Gary. With the episode's runtime being 22 minutes, it really shows how much the timing that they actually did in order to make everything in this episode really good from beginning to end. If I'm ever in this situation, I will make sure I will do everything I can to make sure I'm a good pet owner, but at the same time, I'm not really into pets in the real world. I'm just laying that out there. And considering that the Fairly Odd Parents made fun of Timmy being a terrible pet owner, that show honestly didn't know how to make the characters really likable when it comes to the later seasons. I wouldn't consider this an exception because even though that this is a good episode, it is still a post-movie episode regardless. Granted, it's 16 years old, but at the same time, I just can't get over how the characters were developed later on. But anyway, I'm gonna stop talking about the negatives and I'm gonna get to why Gary decides to head back to SpongeBob. Gary eventually sees the papers involving SpongeBob and Gary, and this leads to him thinking about heading back to SpongeBob since that he's really regretful. But when he's about to leave, he opens a door that reveals so many shells. And it's revealed that Granny, who is her name in this episode, she doesn't have a name, actually overfed all of her previous snails, and they died because of it. They died because they were obese. And I don't usually use that term, but considering I've watched my 600-pound life show from Hulu, I'm pretty sure that I'm really avoiding obese whatsoever since I don't eat as much, and thank goodness I'm not like Gary in this episode. So anyway, Gary tries to escape, and he meets one of the alley snails, and Granny mistakes him as also Miss Tupsy. Let me just say that for an animal who's in this situation, I'm pretty sure that overfeeding is really not a good thing. It's a good thing that limitations actually exist in the real world, and the fact that I'm taking limitations of my eating, Gary honestly did the right call into avoiding anything to do with Granny ever again after this episode. He reunites with SpongeBob, and the episode ends with SpongeBob feeding Gary, even though that Gary has already been overfed by this point. I can say that this episode is probably worth it in order to have this show continue. Granted, later episodes can easily damage of what this episode is mostly good at when it comes to its contributions, but on the other hand, I'm pretty sure that any episode after this, well, aside from A Path of Gary, doesn't mean that this episode is totally unwatchable. It is still a good episode from how the pacing is executed. And considering that the show has becoming the next MCU, the old times from the 2000s will never be the same. And let me just say that if anyone is willing to take ideals from this show when it comes to the good episodes from the post-movie era, it's not really a good sign. And as for me talking about Camp Cola and comparing it to We Baby Bears later this month, I'm pretty sure that there's not gonna be any differences with calling of how SpongeBob can handle spin-offs on their own. So anyway, I give this episode an 8.75 out of 10.
Let's get this started again. Me and my whole